Boa tarde a todos. Na qualidade de diretora do Centro de Estudos Palestinos da Universidade de São Paulo, recebemos e temos um enorme prazer de receber o professor Nur Masalha, que é professor da Universidade de Londres, da Faculdade de Soas, da Universidade de Londres, um dos principais historiadores palestinos da atualidade, que tem 3 livros lançados no Brasil e está aqui visitando a Universidade de São Paulo justamente para falar desses livros, e junto com o professor Nur Masalha, o professor Ahmad Alzoubi, professor de comunicação da Universidade de Lusail, do Catar. É um prazer também recebê-lo. E a gente vai começar essa conversa falando sobre o trabalho, a pesquisa e esses novos livros do professor Nur Masalha, extremamente ricos e que trazem uma abordagem um tanto quanto diferente do que a gente costuma ver sobre a história palestina. Eu queria começar perguntando, professor Nur, e antes de mais nada, muito obrigada por conceder essa entrevista para poder esclarecer a sua pesquisa para o Centro de Estudos Palestinos da USP. Eu queria começar perguntando, e agora eu vou ter que mudar para o inglês para poder falar com o professor Nur, né? So I introduced you, and I'd like to go straight to the questions, right? So I'd like to start asking you, Professor Nur, about your option of going back 4,000 years in your research on Palestine. I mean, the conflict is contemporary. Most research done on Palestine limits itself to the 19th, 20th century to explain what is going on and the conflict today. And in your research here, your option has been to go back thousands of years, 4,000 years or even more. So why did you make that choice, and why has that been your focus of research for the past 10 years at least?
Yes, I was trained as a modern historian, and I wrote about the conflict for about 30, 40 years. I started to publish about the conflict many, many years ago. In fact, one of the early books I have written was about the conflict, and I published this book in Arabic and English 33 years ago. Now it's in Portuguese, and I'm so excited and delighted it's in Portuguese. I did publish a lot of books about early Zionism, about the British in Palestine, about the mandatory period, about the Palestinian Nakba of 1948. So I wrote a lot about the conflict, except I realize in my old age, the last 10 years, that the conflict distorts the history of Palestine, that Palestine was for thousands of years a peaceful place. The conflict did not define the history of Palestine. People existed peacefully for hundreds and hundreds of years. Muslim, Christian, Samaritans, Jews existed in Palestine for hundreds of years. So why is it just people write about the conflict? Is it one way to obscure the history of Palestine? So it's personal dissatisfaction. It's not a critique of what I've done. I think what I've done about 1948 and Nakba is incredibly important. It also has implication for what's happening now in Gaza. And there are certain parallels between what they did, what the Zionists did in 1948, the Nakba, and what they're trying to do now. And some Israeli ministers think we need to finish the job now. But when I decided about 10 years ago to go back to the long history of Palestine, I was quite surprised that Palestine, you can actually find it in Egyptian sources. You find the name Palestine in Egyptian sources 3,300 years ago in the Bronze Age. I was surprised that people talked about Palestine during the Assyrian period. I was surprised to discover that Herodotus visited Palestine 2,500 years ago, and he mentioned Palestine in his most famous book, The Histories. And he comes to Palestine, he visits Palestine, he looks at the shrines and the cities and the language, and he talks about even circumcisions of little boys in Palestine 2,500 years ago. And he talks about polytheistic society in Palestine, nothing to do with monotheism. He mentioned Palestine in his classical book, The History, 6 times. And he describes a country called Palestine. This is Herodotus. This is classical literature. This is the foundation of Western civilization. They all rely on the classical literature. And if you move 500 years later, you have the Roman poet Ovid talks about Palestinian wine. He calls it Liquor Palestina. He loves it. He enjoys it. He actually describes it vividly. He thinks Palestinian wine is one of the best wines in the world. This is the poet Ovid, one of the on the top list of people at Oxford University, actually, who study classics. If you move on to the modern period, Shakespeare, again, the famous playwright on earth, 400 years ago, he wrote a play called Othello. I'm telling you about my amazing discoveries about everyone talked about Palestine. The most famous authors on earth talked about Palestine. Othello, 400 years by Shakespeare. And Shakespeare sits Othello, the playwright, in Venice. And Othello is actually performing in London in front of audiences in London, ordinary people in London. And Othello is a Muslim commander, lives in Venice. He serves in the Venetian army, and he falls in love with a local lady called Desdemona. And Shakespeare put words in the mouth of Desdemona, of course. And Shakespeare says Desdemona would walk barefoot from Venice in Italy to Palestine in order to meet Othello and kiss his lips. Of course, Shakespeare was dramatizing things and exciting his audience, and he wanted that kind of excitement. Of course, it's a dramatic, it's also a tragic story about Othello and Desdemona. But Shakespeare was talking to English audiences 400 years ago, and everyone in the audience knew Palestine. Shakespeare did not have to describe it.
Exactly. He was speaking to someone that people could, something that a land.
They knew exactly. He didn't want to tell them where is Palestine. They knew where is Palestine because Palestine was the Holy Land also. Every single ordinary people in the audience, popular people, knew exactly where is Palestine.
And this
partly because also pilgrims came from Britain, from Europe, flocked to Palestine, hundreds, thousands every year. Palestine under Islam had a lot of Christian pilgrims, and these people came to the city of Jesus. They came to the city of Nazareth. They knew about Palestine so vividly. People in England, in Europe, in the Middle Ages knew about Palestine more than about England or France or Germany. Palestine in the Middle Ages in Europe was, on European maps, the center of the world. Jerusalem was the center of the world. It was the most famous place on earth. This is what I'm actually trying to convey in my book. This is not, please.
No, and this research would be in 4,000 years, right?
4,000 years ago. The reason why I started with the Bronze Age.
This book, let me show the cover of the book we're talking about. So this is the book we're talking about right now. And this was not the last one published. It was the previous.
That's the previous one.
So this was published like a couple of years ago, I guess, right?
It was published here about 2 years ago, I think. Yeah. It was published in London in 2018. This is a bestseller. This is also one of the most famous books I have ever written because it's gone into Bangladeshi editions and Malaysian editions and Korean editions now, and is going to go into Turkish and Polish and Greek and also Spanish in Mexico soon. So it's still a bestseller, one of the most but it's also, people are surprised by it. It's the amount of information. It's the facts. I don't tell a grand narrative, by the way. I'm not telling a big story. I'm just going through the evidence, what really guided me in this book through that. And the reason why I began with the Bronze Age, because the name Palestine began in the Bronze Age.
I see. So how many years back do you find the name Palestine? As far back do you go?
3,300 years ago.
Okay.
If you go to Luxor, if you visit Luxor, the capital of the new kingdom of Egypt, under Ramses II and III, you'll have the name Palestine inscribed on Egyptian temples.
Okay.
This is for the first time we can see the name Palestine, late Bronze Age. And so we're talking about 3,300 years ago. Also, we're talking about a time in the Bronze Age where the alphabet becomes important. The Egyptians had hieroglyphic, so they wrote in pictures. But in the Bronze Age, this is the beginning of the alphabet. And this is the beginning of documenting Palestine in Assyrian sources, in the alphabet. So Palestine is being documented for the last 3,300 years until 1948 in hundreds of sources, in thousands of sources, including some Jewish sources from Cairo, what we call the Jewish Gnezan, including some Jewish authors from antiquity like Josephus. The Jewish author Josephus talks about Palestine. He doesn't talk about Israel because Israel did not exist under the Romans. It was Roman Palestine in which Jesus actually was born there. There's no Roman Israel. There is no such a thing. Only in the fiction mind of Christian Zionists in Sao Paulo. Jesus was born in Palestine. Ovid described Palestine and Palestinian wine 40 years before Jesus. Everyone talked about Palestine. Famous people talked about Palestine. And it continuously. The Arabs talked about Palestine, Philistine. And the Arabs had a province called Palestine. And Arab geographers talked about Palestine. And Ibn Battuta talked about. And Al-Maqdisi, the Palestinian geographer Al-Maqdisi, described the province in Palestine in details. This is 1,000 years ago, Al-Maqdisi, the Jerusalemite. And he described Palestinian identity. Let me actually jump into the question of identity, because I'm not writing about national identity in Palestine or Palestinian nationalism. All nationalism, Palestinian, English, British, Chinese, Japanese, all nationalism is a modern phenomenon. Palestinians are not unique. But I'm not interested in national identity. This is not about national identity. Al-Maqdisi, 1,000 years ago, he described his own identity. He says, I'm a Jerusalemite, I'm a Palestinian, Falastini, he says. I'm also Shami, Syrian, Shami. So he described multiple identities. And this is what the identity of Palestinians at the time. Palestinians at the time, their identity was partly local city identity. If you are from Gaza, you are Gazan. If you are Jerusalem, you are Jerusalemite. If you're from Acre, you are, the identity was always Jesus of Nazareth. That's a fundamental question of identity at the time. Everyone belongs to the town. That's why they call him Jesus of Nazareth. But in fact, Al-Maqdisi, 1,000 years ago, he also talks about Palestine, his own identity. He says, I'm also a Palestinian.
So there are those layers, the town,
multiple
the
layers.
region.
Identity of Palestine is multiple layers. Palestinian identity before nationalism is a multiple identity or multiple layers of identity, regional, local, as well as the reason why Al-Maqdisi was talking about his own Palestinian identity, because he was living in Palestine, in the province of Palestine. في ولاية فلسطين in Arabic. So there was a province, administrative, and that administrative concept of Palestine. So we moved from the name Palestine of the Bronze Age into a administrative entity called Palestine with its own wali, governor, and that's why he was from Jerusalem,
in
which
the
was
Arab period,
during the Arab period, under Islam. Yeah, we're talking about 1,000 years ago, and this is what I call early Islam in Palestine, which is the 400 years of Islamic Palestine until the Latin Crusader. This was a period when Palestine was a province also, with its own wali, its own currency. If you look at Palestinian currency struck in Palestine in gold. In Palestinian cities, it would tell you Palestine in it. So people use currency struck in Palestine, in the city of Ramleh and Jerusalem and Jericho and this and that, and you have the name Palestine on it.
I see.
And that's...
And of course you already had the Dome of the Rock in 900.
You had the Islamic heritage, you had the Christian heritage of Palestine, you had churches which are even older than the Dome of the Rock. You have the Nativity Church in Bethlehem for the Christians. You had the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem. You had also Christian identity in Palestine, which Christian Arabs actually kind of embrace, which is even before Islam, which goes all the way back to Jesus. These early Christian, the birth of Christianity was in Palestine. And there's a continuous line between the followers of Jesus and the Christian Arabs of today. They see themselves as, the inheritors. The Palestinian identity is not confined to Muslims. It's not confined to Christians. There are Samaritans in Nablus who call themselves Palestinians. There are Jews, Arab Jews, until the modern period, until the arrival of the Zionists, they were Palestinian Jews. They were Arab Jews.
And the identity, when you develop the idea of identity, of Palestinian identity, and going back hundreds and hundreds of years, would that be in which book? Which of the two?
I think I begin with this one. I begin with the identity of Palestine. I don't want to confuse people. I wanted people to teach about the identity of the place rather than Palestinian identity.
Okay.
Because the minute we jump into Palestinian, people think we're talking about nationalism. I don't talk about nationalism. I talk about the identity of Palestine, and the people in Palestine saw themselves as Palestinian. Pre-nationalist identity, if you like. It's not a racial identity, it's a cultural, it's a territorial identity. If you lived in an area, in a province called Palestine, you saw yourself partly Palestinian, as well as Jerusalemite, as well as Gaza, as well as this. So it's my book about Palestine.
Okay.
It's not Palestinian, because Palestinian people jump into nationalism. This is pre-nationalism. I do have a chapter towards the very end. And this is the 4,000-year history, which is really talking about multi-layer identity in Palestine. And each layer actually builds on the layer before. And it's also an open identity. People who came from Greece became Palestinian. Some Palestinians wrote in Greek. At the time of Jesus, they used Aramaic, which was very close to Arabic. The Arabs who came to Palestine before Islam were multilinguals, by the way. If you want Arabs in Palestine long before Islam, during the classical period, you have the Arab Nabatean kingdom of the south, which dominated what we call the south of Palestine, which traded with Gaza as well as with the Yemen and brought spices there. This was an Arab kingdom, Nabatean kingdom, which spoke Aramaic as well as Arabic. These people were multilinguals. Multilingualism in Palestine was quite common, in the same way people in Lebanon are multilingual now. They speak French, and they speak Arabic, and they speak all sorts of things. We actually think that multilingualism is kind of a modern kind of invention. In fact, in the old days, because of the mixing people and the migration and the trading and the merchants, you have Gaza merchants actually in Europe. So they needed to learn languages. You have Arabs going to India, or Palestinian Gazans going to India. And there's a lot of mixing. There's a lot of multilingualism. When we look at Palestine during the Byzantine and the Roman, actually some people spoke Greek, Aramaic. They spoke Arabic. They spoke all sorts of. So I think people think Palestine must be just Arabs, or must be just Greek, or must be just Jewish. That's the distortion of the history. What I'm writing about a multicultural society where people interacted with each other, and because Palestine was at the heart of, at the heart of civilizations, if you like, between ancient Iraq and ancient Egypt, there was a lot of movement, there's a lot of fluidity, and also the culture of Palestine was quite a mixed culture at the time.
So what you're saying that, in fact, if you look at Palestinian history, you see a lot more of multicultural and interactions and multiple presence peoples than any kind of exclusive claim to the land.
I want to move away from the exclusivity because it's about Zionism and this and that. In Palestine, during the Roman Greek years, we have Greek merchants. Under Islam, we have Italian merchants actually living in Palestine as communities for many, many, many years, trading merchants and become indigenous, and they become Arabic speaking. Identity is not about race. This is modern nonsense. This is modern racism. Those people who talk about race are racist themselves. There's no, it's not a racial identity. It's a cultural identity, mixed identity, territorial identity, people living together, trading with each other. And that the heritage of Palestine was really that multi-layer, multicultural, multi-religious. You have Christian churches and Muslim churches side by side in Gaza.
And this is so shockingly different.
Very different
from what we see today.
From the segregation,
from the segregation we see
and
today.
From the exclusivity of identity.
From
I'm Jewish. I'm you know, there is no such a thing. I'm Jewish. Arab Jews were Arabic-speaking Jews. Arab Jews in Palestine call their Torah actually Mus'haf. It's the word we use for the Quran. They went to the same schools. They studied in the Kutab schools with Muslims and Christians, and they spoke Arabic. And they lived in towns next to each other. Co-living was the way of life. There was no exclusivity. There was people who came and integrated. We have African people who were Christians and Muslims, and they lived in Palestine. Africans in the sense of not just North African, but African, really sub-Saharan Africans who became Palestinians. Mm. We have Armenians who came in the modern period, became Palestinians. We have Greeks who were Arabized in Palestine. We have Kurds who became, that country just absorbed people.
And by the way, where's your family from?
My family is from the Galilee. Okay. They were peasants. I mean, peasants actually don't move very much, by the way. I mean, my ancestors traced their, on my father's side, traced their ancestors to the Galilee, but on my mother's side, they came from a village near Nablus.
Okay.
And they came in the 18th century to Eastern Galilee, and these two communities, which became Masalha. In fact, it's my mother's side which gave the name Masalha. And they were quite religious, very religious, Sufi religious. And my mother remained deeply kind of Sufi divided until her last days. My father was slightly, but I think we can trace generations of her ancestors to Nablus, or to the region of Nablus, and to being peasants also. They were peasants, really. They were working the land. They didn't travel much. They didn't travel outside the country much. Usually when they traveled on horses or donkeys. They traded locally. They traded in local villages. And also the side of my father, actually. Until the modern period, most peasants actually didn't travel much and cultivate the land. So their roots are deeply related to the land. And I think sometimes I feel I'm a peasant even, you know, after kind of living in London for such a long time. My behavior is a bit kind of, you know, rough and ready. But, you know, it's. I think most Palestinians can say we were peasants. Most Palestinians. The cities were, the urban centers were much smaller. I think maybe about more than 2/3 actually live on the land and cultivated the land. And the land where my ancestors cultivated was Marj ibn Amr, some of the most fertile parts of the country. And that area cultivated cotton for hundreds of years. And they sold cotton through the port of Akka to Europe. So you have Venetian merchants living in that area and buying cottons. And cottons was a big industry in Palestine. If you go to Jerusalem, you have the cotton market from the Mamluk era, Souk al-Qattanin, what we call.
Wow.
And you know, people tell you about the cultivation of cotton before the cultivation of oranges, which was modern cultivation.
Yeah.
So cotton was a big thing. Olive oil was a big thing. And even as a child, we always cultivated olives, and we also went to the press and we squeezed the olives, and we came back with olive jars and which lasted throughout the winter. See, we really lived off the land. Mm-hmm. Olive oil industry is such a long industry. As a historian who learned a lot from archaeologists, in my forthcoming book, I talk about the olive tree being 7,000 years old. So actually, archaeologists actually teach me more than the documents. So olive cultivation, the olive oil industry, and I also learned that Palestinians sold olive oil to Egypt, but also beyond Egypt. Mm-hmm. They sold it to the Yemen. They sold it to the Europe in jars. They used to put olive oil in jars and to ship it to Europe. So there was a lot of trade going on between Palestine. Palestine is actually, Eastern Mediterranean, is the intersection, is the crossroad between Europe Africa, and Asia. And that's why its cities are so old. That's why it did flourish for such a long time, because it was actually on the
Total economic
on the international
integration.
routes. Palestine was on the route of spices from India, from Indonesia to Europe. The Gaza merchants actually were buying spices all the way from India and transporting these spices to Italy and to Rome and to the Italian cities. That's why Gaza becomes such a flourishing city. It's right at the heart of these international trade routes, from spices to textile to silk. At some stage, silk started to come through the Red Sea to the port city of what today known as Aqaba. So you have a Gazan community of merchants living in Aqaba and bringing silk from China all the way to not just to Palestine, but all the way to Europe. And it's amazing how Palestine was globalized. We think globalism or globalization is a kind of modern idea, started in the 80s, but there was a lot of global trade actually going on between Asia, and Palestine somehow sat in the middle. And I think the wealth of Palestinian cities, and especially cities, and the antiquities of these cities is to do with flourishing under the impact of trade. Agriculture was much smaller, but trade made these cities very famous. And we had a lot of port cities also, from Jaffa to Akka to Gaza. I keep telling people that each city had one port for export. Gaza had 2 ports in antiquity, because the volume of exports coming through Gaza was such a huge thing. Gaza needed 2 ports to transport. And it became famous in antiquity as the shop of the world. The shop. If you wanted to shop for anything, you would go to Gaza. So this is what I learned from facts. This is not something which I'm trying to create as a grand narrative for Palestine in order to satisfy Palestinian nationalism. I just wanted to follow the evidence. And I think if we follow the evidence, you learn more than from narrative stories, because I think narratives can be slightly rough. While the evidence, you have to follow it. And the evidence is more complicated.
This is certainly a characteristic of the 3 books. They go into sources, documents, evidence. And jumping now through time, this is also what you do in The Expulsion of the Palestinians, the earliest book actually that you published here in Brazil, which is this one. Let me show the cover of that book. This has been translated for maybe 4 or 5 years already, although it's the first time you're coming to present the book, right?
That's
so
right.
Here you're talking about the concept of transfer, and the evidence that you collect indicate that when was this concept created, or when did it become like part of the common understanding of how Zionism and British colonialism would deal with
I mean,
Palestinians?
I was brought up in the Galilee, and nobody really talked about it much when I was a student, actually, in Jerusalem. But when I went back in the late 80s, in 1988, 89, and I went into Israeli archival sources, I was quite shocked. It was a surprise to me, because me studying in Jerusalem, no one actually mentioned this idea at the time. Now they talk about it openly, and they, their main sponsor in the White House also talks about it, even in a rough, vulgar, almost crazy language. But at the time when I went into Israeli archives in the late 80s, I just had done my PhD on Iraq, and I thought, I went back to find out whether I could actually teach at Birzeit University. This was 88, the beginning of the Palestinian Intifada, and I couldn't actually find a job, by the way, there. And people actually were teaching from home. And I went into Israeli archives, and the reason why I went into Israeli archives, partly because I know Hebrew very fluently. I know the language so well. So I started from the Zionist Central Archives in Jerusalem. Then I went into the State Archives, also in Jerusalem. Then I went into kibbutzim archives, and then into private archives, and so on. I was quite surprised how much material there is about this idea. And at the time in 1988, people were talking about new historians, but I didn't come across this stuff in the publications of new historians, because I've read some of the stuff by Benny Morris. And I was quite struck dumb. When I looked some of these documents during my research into Israeli archives, I was quite shaking. I didn't realize there is so much about it. And I'm talking about documents, I'm talking about minutes of meetings, I'm talking about transfer committees in this book. I'm talking about this period of the 30s and 40s and the last 20 years before 1948. I also looked at the period from the early Zionism with Herzl. I looked at the diaries of Herzl. There's very little about it there. People do mention it, but it's not a major preoccupation. It's not obsession. When I got to the 30s, I realized there's an obsession there. There's also a consensus emerging. There's a consensus among the Zionist leadership in Palestine that you cannot create a Jewish state without kicking the Palestinians. The Zionist objective was to create a majority Jewish state in Palestine, and Zionists started to migrate to Palestine. By the 1930s, there was a certain amount of Jewish migration from Germany because of the rise of fascism. But in the 1930s, the Zionist leadership in Palestine thought migration, slow settlements will never create a Jewish state. This is the conclusion. This is where we come to the 30s. This is where the only way to create a Jewish state is to kick them out, is to expel them, is to create that demographic obsession. And this is obsession by the top leaders such as Ben Gurion. We also see it among Weizmann. In 1930, Weizmann, who was the head of the Zionist organization, both in Palestine and in London, actually submits a transfer plan to the British in 1930, which I talk about in this book. For the first time, I see top Zionist leader talking about shifting the Palestinian population from Palestine to Jordan and to Iraq. The 1930s is a turning point. For me and for the Zionist leadership. But at the time we get to the mid-30s, there's an obsession. There's a transfer committees, there's transfer plans. There's so much in the diaries of Ben Gurion and Yosef Weitz, who was the head of the Jewish National Fund, about if we don't transfer them, if we don't transfer is a euphemistic word for expelling them. Mass expulsion. They were not talking about individuals moving them. They were talking about moving villages and towns to Transjordan. Some of these plans, they were talking about building settlements for them in Transjordan. In the way Trump talks about building settlements for kicking the Palestinians millions out of Gaza and building places for them in Jordan and Egypt, he was talking about. Some of these Zionists were using the same language. We will build cities for them in Jordan. Cities. We will transfer them en masse. And of course, it's naive to think that the Palestinians actually would agree to that sort of thing. They would resist any kind of transfer. But this is where the consensus or the obsession or the mindset or the premeditation between the 30s of 1948, I argue, on the basis of the evidence. And I did follow the evidence. I do argue until then there is no obsession. I looked at the 1920s. There is no Zionist obsession with transfer. I looked at Herzl. Herzl talks about, we will live with the peasants and we will educate them, we'll bring civilizations to them. We are,
superior, etc.
Yeah, all sorts of things. Yeah, he's got all sorts of ideas, kind of, We will cultivate the land. We will bring money, this and that. We've got a lot of rich Jews and this and that. He's very proud of, Jewish banks in Europe But in the 30s, when I follow the evidence, we have mountains and mountains of documents. This is when they realize that you can't create a Jewish state. And this is when they feel also slightly more confident because there is a Jewish army Zionist army in the making, the Haganah and the Palmach. And they started thinking, perhaps we can actually expel them. Except the British were still there. And you can't do it when the British had. So there's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of thinking, planning. And it's a mindset. That mindset, we can still see it in 1948, because in 1948 also they set up a transfer committee. They call it transfer. And I see it from within. I see it from the way they thought about it, by the way, because I think for me, coming as a Palestinian, looking at these documents, speculating, it would not proving anything. And this is what distinguishes this book from every single book about this period, about 1948. It's not just about 1948, it's the run-up to 1948. it's the way 48 was conducted also, is the way, of course, 48 was expulsion. A lot of these villages and towns was just driven out by guns and this and that. But the mindset was there. And I think if you look at the diaries also of 48 and compare it to the diaries of 30s of Ben Gurion, there's a lot of passages which are common too.
Now, this is very interesting when you say that the mindset was there, because of course, if you don't you don't know these documents, you've never gone through them, you can see only the largest, like 1937, the Peel Commission report, it speaks about transfer. It sets the idea of transfer.
But where does the idea come from?
Exactly.
I argue in this book that the Peel Commission asked for submissions from the Zionists and from the Palestinians. Some Palestinians spoke to this commission, and there was a submission from the Jewish Agency to transfer the Palestinians. The Peel Commission was pro-Zionist. There's no question about that. They suggested partition, but we have evidence. We have a smoking gun. There was a Zionist proposal, if you like, suggestion or submitted to the Peel Commission from the Zionists saying transfer is an option. Did they? Do I try to exonerate the British and just blame the Zionists? No, they're both as bad as each other.
And if they were proposing transfer over to Jordan, it's because the British were agreeing with it.
That's right. Yeah, the British were as bad as the Zionists, because the British actually were subduing the Palestinian uprising at the time, and they're using planes to bomb Palestinian cities. So the British were part of the crushing the Palestinians, subduing them. I'm not saying the British were goodies and the Zionists were baddies. I think the two sides actually, at one particular moment in history, in 1937, they come to the same conclusion, except the British abandoned partition in 1939, but the Zionists continued to submit and to continue to set up transfer committees. And when we get to the early 40s, and I show how the head of the Zionist settler organization in Palestine, in their diaries, they keep saying, we're not going to catch up with them. We're not going to set up big settlements. The Jewish kibbutzim will always be tiny. The Arab villages will always be very big, much bigger than us. The only way is to clear them. This is what Joseph Weitz says. So the Zionists they go on and on and on throughout the early 40s. And some of them, Joseph Weitz visits Syria, and he visits Al Jazeera, part of Syria. He thought Palestinians might be shifted to Al Jazeera, and he described in details his trips about Al Jazeera, and he writes in his diaries about, we can shift the Palestinians to Al Jazeera. If we can't do it in Transjordan, we'll do it in Syria, eastern Syria. There's a lot of land there for them. Some people talk about Iraq. Ben Gurion actually comes to the conclusion that Transjordan is not a good idea, because we might expand to Transjordan gradually, slowly. We need to push them further. And I think what I'm arguing, that obsession with transfer is so overwhelming in these diaries, in these minutes, and you can read them in Hebrew. And for someone like me, not knowing them, it was quite a shock, surprise. So when I wrote this book, some people looked at it and said, is this true? Can it be true? Because Israelis didn't write about it. But there are some Israelis now, against the background of the Israeli onslaught on Gaza, talk about some of these ideas, and they publish some of these articles in Haaretz now, because they think the Israeli government is actually pushing in that direction now, because the Israeli ministers talk about new Nakba, another Nakba, finishing the job now. So some liberal Israelis say, look, we've done it before. We thought about it before, these things. So it's actually, Haaretz did publish a number of articles recently just about this idea of transfer. But I say to them, Haaretz is about 77 years later, since the Nakba. So, there are certain parallels, but with what's happening now, and there are Israeli ministers on the hard right think we can do it. Yes, we can do it now. It's the golden opportunities. And when Trump came up with this idea, there were huge celebration in Israel. They were ecstatic. They were actually drunk with not just military kind of successes, but Now we can do it.
Mm.
And it's quite shocking for someone like me who studied 1948 and studied how traumatic was for us and how our society was destroyed. And Ahmad is a refugee from one of these villages expelled in 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And I have relatives who are also refugees in Zarqa. And I have, relatives on my mother's side, and I have also some of my relatives came from these destroyed villages of 1948.
Mm-hmm. The 530 destroyed villages.
It's was the most traumatic event until the Gaza war. Mm. And now we have a new trauma. So I think, if you like, I think after publishing this, I went to oral history of Palestine, and I started to interview people. And I did a documentary with a Palestinian woman called Maurice Gargour from Jaffa called The Land Speaks Arabic. I think the document is actually...
I've seen it.
It's about my research. But we've done a lot of oral history, actually. So it's not just archival history. I did move on to the question of the refugees and the voice of the refugees and how these people actually saw 1948. And so there's a lot, we've done a lot since that period. The last, since the publication of this book, I think we've done a lot of stuff about 1948. It wasn't just me, I'm not just the hero of the moment, and I think I'm glad we started to do it more scientifically, more systematically, not just as a kind of fiction, or not just as a propaganda, or not just as narrative. It's not just about creating a Palestinian narrative, but it's about finding evidence, finding documents, training scholars to study things actually in a kind of accurate way, to look at the truth, to look at facts, to distinguish between facts and fiction, to distinguish between myth and propaganda. That's the way to do Palestine studies for me.
That sounds a wonderful method. I wish it were, more adopted around. But it's difficult to speak about any perspective while we're living a genocide, an ongoing genocide at the moment, a terrible massacre going on. But I guess that the research you do, going into facts and going so far back, actually puts in perspective that this exclusivist, ultra-nationalist, colonial Zionist project is such a small part of Palestinian history. This might give us some kind of optimistic perspective, maybe, which is so difficult at the moment to have, but of how the land brings a lot more richness than despair, than the despair that we're seeing now.
Absolutely. I think before the advent of Zionism, before the conflict, people actually remember living side by side, a bit like in Andalus, if you like. The long history of Palestine gives us a more peaceful existence and coexistence, and it teaches us a lot. I think we can learn from the past both positively. Also, we can learn the long lessons. The long lessons of the Holocaust is not to repeat the Holocaust. The long lessons of the right lessons of the Nakba is not to repeat the Nakba. The right lessons from Palestine is to realize that for hundreds and for thousands of years, people lived side by side, and there was no conflict. This obsession with the conflict somehow obscure the fact that we can learn from the past how people coexisted side by side without replacing each other, without displacing each other, without claiming even exclusivity.
Wonderful. Yes. Well, we will have also your speech tonight recorded and put on YouTube, also at the Center for Palestine Studies YouTube channel. So also you can go into that. I'd like to ask Ahmad, who has been silent here because we've been speaking about Nur Masalha's work and his visit to Brazil. Ahmad, who is also visiting Brazil, although he lived here for a few years. I'm going to switch to Portuguese. I'm sorry, Nur. Ahmad eu queria começar perguntando, então, de qual vilarejo você e sua família, de onde vocês vêm, de onde vocês foram expulsos?
Obrigado.
E muito bem-vindo.
Obrigado. Minha família chegou no Jordânia depois do dia de Nakba, 15 de maio. Meu nome de cidade é Bissan, como cidade pequena chamada Sirin. Refugiou no Palestina, emigrou no 1948 para cidade na Jordânia chamada Erbet.
Ah, ok, certo, muito bem. E você está lançando no Brasil um livro que foi o seu trabalho, sua pesquisa de mestrado aqui no Brasil, e é um livro que fala sobre a imigração, né? Sobre a imigração dos palestinos para a América Latina, não só o Brasil, mas outros países. Você poderia falar um pouquinho sobre esse livro? Deixa eu mostrar também a capa desse livro que está sendo lançado, e no site do Monitor do Oriente, deve ser possível de comprar, correto? Todos esses livros podem ser comprados no site do Monitor do Oriente. Monitor do Oriente, né?
Sim. Há outras também.
E outros também. Muito bem, muito bom.
Sobre
Que
a aula
trabalho.
do professor Nur, nós temos comunidade ou tem pessoas emigrou na Latinoamérica. Eu escolhi 5 países para esse estudo quando eu estudei na Universidade Metodista de São Paulo. 5 países escolhi Brasil, Argentina, Honduras, El Salvador e Chile. 2 países no Centro-América, Chile, porque
Sim,
países muito grandes de comunidade palestina.
El Salvador e Honduras.
A Chile.
Ah, Chile.
A
O
Chile,
Chile é a maior comunidade.
Sim, maior comunidade.
Qual o tamanho agora? 300 mil?
No Chile tem mais ou menos 500 mil. Escolher também o Brasil, porque o Brasil é um país muito grande, capital de política, de mídia, de comunicação, dirigindo a Latinoamérica. Quando eles apoiam a Palestina como segundo mandato de Lula em 2011, e quando ele conhecido a fronteira de Palestina, de Estado, 4 de junho de 1967, maior estados, a todos os estados da Latinoamérica, apoio como ele também ele é reconhecido. Também quando nós olhando de outro lado, quando Bolsonaro quer transferir a embaixada brasileira a Tel Aviv para Jerusalém, também tem poucos estados na Latinoamérica, países andando também atrás dele para ele se transferir. O Brasil tem um peso muito grande quando fala com Palestina ou com ocupação. Também escolhi a Argentina porque o livro branco no Herzl, ele quer escolher 3 países, ou Uganda, ou Argentina, ou nossos países na Palestina. Esses estudos de conteúdo também sobre comunidade nesses 5 países.
Então, Chile, a maior comunidade. Brasil, que você considera um país central para a questão palestina nas relações com a Palestina. Argentina, está explicado. Honduras e El Salvador.
Honduras e El Salvador, eu escolhi 2 países porque é Centro-América. Também chegou na comunidade Honduras e El Salvador muitos anos atrás, de 1900, chegando também depois de Nakba, 1948, chegou também maior comunidade. Eles também muito fortes lá no Honduras e El Salvador, para comunicação, para políticas, para lideranças de comunidade. Você sabia, esses dias, o presidente de Salvador, filho de emigrou de Palestina, Najib Bukele. Ele também é comunidade muito forte, é preciso estudo, profundidade sobre eles também.
Muito bem. E você, qual o período de chegada principal, né? Em que décadas, mais ou menos, essa imigração palestina, a maior parte veio para a América Latina?
Tem duas linhas por essas perguntas importantes. Tem poucas pessoas chegou antes de Nakba. Também, quando também tem revelação, 1936, e tem ocupação está nascendo, né? Tem também problema de Imperatriz de Otomano, 1900 chegando também. Tem pessoas que chegou nesses períodos, 1900 até 1936, 38. Na minha pesquisa, não achou muitas pessoas chegando antes de 1880.
Tá.
Mais comunidade chegou, mais pessoas chegou, mais família depois de 1900. Mas depois de Nakba, muitas famílias chegaram no Brasil. A comunidade palestina nascendo no Brasil depois de Nakba, depois de 1948. Também na Argentina. No Chile, a Honduras tem pouco realizado antes de 48.
Uhum. E as levas de imigrantes, de palestinos que vieram para a América Latina, vieram principalmente de uma ou outra região da Palestina. Por exemplo, eu sei que tem uma migração grande de Belém e aí Beit Saur, né?
Sim.
Ou tem outras regiões
Né?
também da Palestina que...
Esse eu acho uma coisa importante. Até agora, eles considerados sobre emigrou, refugiou, a transferir também palestinos na Latinoamérica como países, como estados, como o Qura no língua árabe, porque eles têm fazer uma comunidade, uma família, irmãos, amigos, primas, para eles trabalham juntos. Porque quando o palestinos chegam nesses períodos, também especificamente no dia de anexa, 5 de junho de 67 a 48, eles passam fome, passam sofrimento. Eles precisam também de pessoas de ajuda, de irmãos, de amigos, de período. Aqui no Brasil, é o maior de comunidade de palestinos no Ramallah, المزرعة الشرقية, Silwad,
Tá,
Yalo, interior de Ramallah.
tá.
No Chile, também Betlehem, interior de Betlehem, Bet Jala, interior de Bet Jala, Jerusalém, esses também, ou atrás deles. Também tem outras cidades no Palestina, tem no Gaza, tem no Al-Khalil, tem no Bissan.
Al-Khalil, que chamam de Hebron.
Sim, sim. Mas tem muitas comunidades, especificamente no Ramallah, no Brasil. Al-Khalil, no Venezuela. Bet Jala, Betlehem, no Chile. Especificamente Bet Sahur, no Honduras. Jerusalém, pessoas que vivem no Jordânia, no Honduras. Porque eles fazem comunidade para fazer cultura. Eles também chegam para resultados no nosso, no meu pesquisa para palestinos até agora, até hoje, 2025, tem pessoas no Chile, chegou antes 100 anos. 100 anos, tem um clube muito forte,
Sim.
tem banco, tem grupo de futebol, tem língua árabe, tem comida. Eles até agora reservaram para a cultura deles. Quando tem pessoas que querem casar, transferir a família dele para a Jordânia, ou para campo de refugiados no Síria, ou no Kuwait, ou no Palestina, para eles escolher uma mulher e transferir para Chile, especificamente no Chile.
Ou seja, voltava para casar e vinha de novo.
Até agora. Também tem pessoas transferir a família dele para morar poucos anos para a Palestina, especificamente no Jerusalém, compra casa muito caro para eles aprender língua árabe, costume, o que respeita de mulheres, de pessoas velhas, de tios, de primos.
Certo.
Esses costumes até agora chegando para também mais força. Quando tem uma cobertura negativa para palestinos esses dias no causa de Palestina, eles também apoiam a família deles para transferir lá.
Ao mesmo tempo em que você fala sobre esses elementos da relação com as regiões de origem, o Brasil e a América Latina em geral é bastante conhecido por ser um local de integração, né, onde as comunidades imigrantes conseguem se integrar e se sentem integrados. Isso aconteceu com as imigrações palestinas? Eles são bastante integrados na América Latina? Se sentem parte da América Latina?
Eu acho essas perguntas importantes também, porque o Brasil, a Latinoamérica é muito grande. Tem pessoas muito simpáticas para recebendo comunidade palestinas ou famílias palestinas. Mas não esquece, tem poucos anos, na década de 1930 até 1940, por exemplo, a Argentina tem lei para não chegando palestinos dentro dos países deles, porque eles bárbaras ou palestinofobia ou turcosfobia. Também aqui no Brasil tem poucos dias, quando tem a Usba Andalucia, Shuara al-Mahjar, eles apresentou o árabes, poesia de árabes também apresentou.
A literatura Mahjar, né, de imigrantes.
O lei também no Brasil não apoia pessoas publica no jornal, só língua de Latinoamérica, língua de portuguesa. Também tem pouco de racismo esses anos.
Tá. Mas e hoje? Ou seja, isso foi na década de 30. Hoje, essas comunidades palestinas no Chile, no Brasil, ao redor da América Latina...
Não, hoje é diferente. Hoje, agora, a comunidade é forte. Mas quando eles chegamos, muitas pessoas trocam nomes. Por
certo.
quê? Nome de Muhammad, nome de Ahmed, nome de Abdallah.
Para se integrar mais e não
Mas,
ficar tão
sim,
estigmatizado.
também
Aham.
tem história de Argentina, quando as pessoas chegam, ou pergunta à polícia lá no Santiago ou no Santos, qual religião de pessoas. Eles falam religião diferente.
Tá.
Porque tem muito racismo. Mas hoje a comunidade forte, antes de 50 anos e 40 anos, mas hoje a comunidade muito respeitada para governos nesses países, para outras também na comunidade, porque chegou a fazer coisas muito fortes no países, ajuda de comerciante, ajuda de mercado, ajuda para políticas, também muitas lideranças têm no cada área, no palestinos, nesses países,
Uhum,
especificamente no Brasil, também de outro lado.
uhum.
Eu acho também a comunidade importante abrir uma porta sobre esses comentários. Para mim, tem pessoas no Brasil ou outros países esses dias, esquerda, apoio palestinos ou direita, mas quando tem uma coisa de causa de Palestina, esquerda, direita de comunidade, apoio causa palestina. Dia de sagrado deles, 29 de novembro. Todos anos, no 29 de novembro, eles apresentar causa palestina.
Uhum. Bom, então eu vou mais uma vez mostrar aqui o livro, né? E o livro também trata da imigração, trata da Palestina na mídia, trata de vários aspectos. Aliás, para um mestrado, eu devo observar que é um trabalho extenso, é um trabalho amplo, né? Notável para um mestrado, que hoje em dia está cada vez menor. Então, parabéns, Ahmad. Tá um trabalho interessantíssimo, né? Entrando aí na mídia e tudo mais. E, bom, eu poderia continuar horas perguntando para o Ahmad and also with more questions to Nur, but we really have to wrap this up. So I'd really like to thank both of you, Nur. It's been really great to listen to your all your explanation about, I mean, a little bit of what you do in these three books, but enough for us to know what it's about and know what you are looking at and your method of research, which of course is fundamental in what the books are and what the outcome is of this very, very rich research. E Ahmad, muito obrigada também, né? Agradeço muitíssimo. If you would like to just finish off with like very, very rapid commentaries, please.
Many thanks for this. It's great to be here. Great to see you again for the second time, or maybe third time actually. I saw you in London.
Yeah.
I think the idea of not just publishing things personally, but the idea of expanding knowledge, the idea of expanding Palestine studies across. I think Palestine has a universal message. Unlike some people who think Palestine is just about Palestine, Palestine was never just about Palestine. If you think about the message of Jesus, it was a universal message. This evening I will talk about the alphabet, which was created in Palestine, or invented in Palestine, a Proto-Canaanite alphabet. It was a universal kind of system which Palestine contributed. And I think there's something about Palestine which is universal. And that's the message which I would like to convey. It's not just about narrow kind of thinking. It's about our story as a humanities, and you can learn from Palestine about Latin America and indigenous communities in Latin America. Palestine has been the indigenous communities of Palestine. You can compare what happened to indigenous communities in Australia, which suffered also under colonialism. So our story is it's our story, but it's also the story of other communities. So I think there is something about Palestine, whether it's the universality of its message, whether it's freedom, but also whether it's about saying Palestine and Palestinian studies about all of us.
Thank you very much, Professor Nur Masalha. Ahmad, gostaria de falar algumas palavras finais?
Sim, eu acho melhor na comunidade palestinos no Brasil, também brasileiros, como eu sou brasileiro, fala português. O primeiro visita de Pedro II fora no Brasil, na Latinoamérica, Você sabe onde?
Foi na Palestina.
No Gaza, na faixa de Gaza.
Oh.
O Gaza, como relação com palestinos também, tem relação muito positiva, muito bonito com palestinas. Pessoas lá, como eu sou também jornalistas, boa nós brasileiros, a mídia de brasileira, olhando para apresentar verdade, não apresentar como agência internacional ou agência de imperialismos, fala negativo com Palestina até hoje, quando pessoas apoiam pessoas ou a base na Palestina, ou chama eles turcofobia, hamasofobia, islamofobia, gazafobia. Esses, eu acho importante, 2025 mudou essa opinião.
Muito obrigada, Ahmad Alzoubi. E eu não consigo pronunciar corretamente o nome do Ahmad, que eu tenho...
by the way, congratulations on the book and Mabruk. I should have said this before.
Bom, muito obrigada. Então, obrigada aos dois.
Thank you. Yeah.